No. What happened?
Okay, we are live now. I don't know, I had to click through some terms of service stuff to agree there. Sorry, everyone, for starting this a little bit late. We had some technical issues we were working through. My browser was crapping itself because I'm on a Mac and trying to use Safari, and it hates Google, apparently. So I'm Ian. I run the Steelers and that. I'm here with AJ. He is either AJ Andrew 83 or AJ WPIAL on Twitter. And you may have watched our season preview show, and we're here to talk about where things stand at the halfway point in the season. AJ, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am AJ. I run AJWPIAL on Twitter, and I also have a blog, WPIALfootballzone.wordpress.com, and I'm a reporter for WesternPAFootball.net.
Okay, great. So I think we're ready to roll here. So why don't we just start off at the top with what's impressed you so far this season? You want to just start at Quad A, roll all the way through? I haven't gotten any questions from anyone on Twitter yet, so I'll kind of keep an eye out there. If anyone wants to send us any questions on Twitter, I am at the Steelers and AJ is at AJWPIAL. So feel free to tweet us some questions during the show if you have them. So AJ, what's impressed you so far?
What I've liked out of Quad A is I think Pine Richland I really love. They are really good. I've also gotten to see Penn Trafford. I went to the Saturday game against McKeesport. Their defense is really underrated there, and what John Ruane has done over there with that program is just simply amazing. I mean, Brett LaFoon, he's a great quarterback. Timmy Vecchio, he's a great receiver, and he just comes up with the big plays and all of that. And I want to read my rankings for next week. I got Central Catholic at 1, and I got Woolen Hills at 2. I got Pine Richland up at 3, Penn Trafford at 4, then North Hills up at 5, who plays Pine Richland this week, and then McKeesport, Penn Hills, and Mount Lebanon.
It's tough to argue with those rankings. Central Catholic has just been incredible on defense this year, and I agree with you about Penn Trafford. I think when we talked at the beginning of the year, we pretty much said that Penn Trafford McKeesport game was probably going to decide who would win the Foothills Conference, and the way it looks right now, you've kind of got Plum and Norwin that have stacked a couple wins there, but everyone else has at least 2 losses and doesn't look real good to start the season. So I think Penn Trafford's in real good shape to run the table there, and McKeesport should be in pretty good shape to come in second in that conference and get a home playoff game. It'll be interesting to see who comes in third, though, because 2 of the 3 third-place teams in Quad A get home playoff games, and right now you've got Plum and Norwin both sitting at 2-1, but Plum has a head-to-head win over Norwin. So and you never know. I mean, at the beginning of the year, I kind of thought that Kiski was probably the 3rd best team in that conference, but they've really struggled on defense this year. I think they've given up over 200. Hempfield and Latrobe, who are 2 of the bottom teams in the conference right now. So it's going to take a lot for Kiski to get back in it. I think they play Plum this week, so that might kind of be an ultimatum on Kiski's chances to make the playoffs. And really, everyone else should kind of breeze through in the Foothills this week. I think McKeesport has Hempfield, and Penn Trafford has Latrobe, and Norwin Altoona could be a game that has some playoff implications, but I think Penn Trafford's certainly the best team in that conference, and like you said, the job their coaching staff's done there has been incredible.
Plum is very improved from last season. I think they are really good, and them and Norwin have really impressed me out of that Foothills Conference. It'll be interesting to see what they do against like a Penn Trafford or a McKeesport because they got to play each other eventually.
Yeah, I was surprised at just how much Penn Trafford beat McKeesport by. Um, I was kind of following you along on Twitter, and you were at the game, and it was surprising, just how much Penn Trafford was able to control that game. I thought McKeesport would able to be able to mount a little bit more of an offensive attack against them, but I guess like you said, Penn Trafford's defense just is that good.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was even surprised at the result. I just didn't see that one coming.
Yeah, and in the Northern Eight Conference, I think you said Central Catholic's your number one team, and Pine Richland and North Hills were both up there in your top 10 too. Um, Actually, the Northern Eight's the only conference with three undefeated teams left in it, and Central Catholic and Pine Richland have both looked really good so far this year, and North Hills has kind of been sneaky good. Um, Pine Richland won that incredible game that was on Root Sports over North Allegheny, where they threw that touchdown pass in overtime, which was just an incredible finish. It's what high school football is all about. But I think the biggest surprise for me in Quad A has been just how poorly Seneca Valley has done. We all picked them to make it to Heinz Field in our season preview, and they haven't won a game yet, and they've really struggled on offense since TJ Hall got hurt.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised at how they've struggled. And then, like I said, North Hills has Pine Richland this week, so that's definitely going to be a crucial game that Pine Richland needs to win. And then they got Central Catholic at Highmark later in the year. But Seneca Valley, I didn't think they would actually be that bad without TJ Hull. I mean, just goes to show how good of an athlete the kid is.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you there. And it'll be kind of interesting to see too, who gets that fifth playoff spot out of the Northern Eight Conference. Because I mean, Central Catholic, Pine Richland, North Hills are essentially going to be in, and North Allegheny should be, good enough to make it in the fourth or the third spot if they can get past North Hills. But then you've got Butler, Fox Chapel, Seneca Valley, and Shaler, who are all kind of, well, Shaler probably had their best chance to win a game when they played Butler this past week, although they still have Seneca Valley on the schedule, but they've got the longest losing streak in the WPIAL that they're riding right now. But nevertheless, I mean, between Butler, Fox Chapel, and Seneca Valley, one of those three is going to have to make the playoffs.
I agree. Yeah, after North Allegheny, it's just anyone. It could be up for grabs. I mean, anyone could make the playoffs in that conference.
Yeah. Moving on to the Southeastern Conference, which actually probably has I don't know if I want to say the best, but maybe because the best matchup this week is probably North Hills at Pine Richland, but the most meaningful game between Woodland Hills and Upper St. Clair. I never thought I would see a Jim Render team start the season 1-3, but Upper St. Clair has had a really tough go of it. I mean, they lost to a very good Penn Hills team in the first week of the season. They came back and beat Peters Township, and then they lost a close game to Bethel Park, who always seems to give them trouble, and then lost a non-conference game to North Allegheny last week. So it's kind of weird seeing the Panthers that far down on the table. But they can certainly make a big statement with a good showing against Woodland Hills this week.
Yeah, Upper St. Clair they've surprised me also. I just don't. The coach like Jim Render, it's hard to see them 1-3 like that. I mean, when they got Woodland Hills this week, which is a huge game, it's going to be a really interesting game because Upper St. Clair, they need a win desperately, I think. And then
Yeah.
the team I like is in the Southeastern is Bethel Park. Bethel Park could actually maybe actually make some noise too in that conference.
Yeah, Bethel Park brought back a lot of kids that played last year, and I think Levi Matheny, the quarterback's the son of the coach there too. So they've they've got some good stuff going there, and their win over Upper St. Clair is going to carry them a good ways. Mount Lebanon's been a nice surprise too, bouncing back after they missed the playoffs last year. But we kind of said at the beginning of the year when we talked that Penn Hills and Woodland Hills were probably the best two teams in the conference, and the two of them would probably be fighting it out for the conference title, which anytime two rivals fight it out for the conference title is great to see. You get like a Mount Lebanon Upper St. Clair game the last week of the year for the conference title, or a Penn Hills Woodland Hills game the last week for the conference title. That always makes for added fire to the rivalry, and that seems to be where we're headed this year as well.
Yeah, Penn Hills they are good. In my opinion, I mean, got a lot of playmakers on offense, especially with Billy Kisner and Isaiah Jones and Tayshawn Campbell. They just, towards the end of the year, that Penn Hills game, I think, will decide the Southeastern Conference ultimately.
Yeah, and I think the Southeastern is definitely the best conference in Quad A. I mean, we were kind of talking about we have no idea who's gonna be that fifth team in the Northern Eight. You kind of have the opposite discussion in the Southeastern Conference of which team isn't going to make it, between a Baldwin, who's a decent team. They've lost a couple games to Mount Lebanon and Woodland Hills, which you can hardly blame anyone for losing those games. And then Peters Township, who's not a bad team either. One of those teams, and then Upper St. Clair's sitting in fifth place right now in the conference, which the top five make it. But if Upper St. Clair slips up anymore, they could be in trouble.
Yeah, I agree. Baldwin, I mean, Sterling Jenkins, he's a beast there. I mean, and he actually might play in some national games too, because he's gotten that many offers. He's got so many, so it should be interesting to see where he goes exactly. So Baldwin, I think, would make they have a slim chance to make the playoffs. We'll see.
Yeah, they're going to have to basically beat Cannon McMillan and Peters Township, and then hope they win some kind of tiebreaker to get that wild card playoff spot. Although they lost a non-conference game to Butler, which could come into play. I don't know. Quad A has some weird playoff rules this year for that wild card spot, because I think everyone in the Southeast plays everyone in the Northern 8 once, and those games count towards the playoffs for that wild card spot, but then games they play against the Foothills don't count or something like that. Or no, they play games against AAA teams, because Penn Hills was lost to Central Valley. That's right.
Woodland Hills, yeah. Later in the year, Woodland Hills has that other game against West Allegheny. That's going to be a huge game. I might try to go out to that one.
Yeah, that's that might be the regular season game of the year. Woodland Hills has an absolutely brutal end of the season. I mean, they have to go to West Allegheny and then to Mount Lebanon, and then they play Penn Hills at home, which is their rivalry game to end the season. That's not an easy end of the schedule.
We'll be ready for the playoffs after that, for sure.
Yeah, well, Woodland Hills always seems like a team that starts off a little slow and builds momentum through the season. So we'll get a good test of them, in a couple weeks on October 10th when they go to West Allegheny, and then the weeks after that with Mount Lebanon and Penn Hills, which will pretty much decide that conference.
Yeah, Bethel Park actually gave them a huge scare earlier in the year. They survived that one, though.
Yeah, and like you said, Bethel Park's a good team. That's a team I would not want to have to play in the first round of the playoffs. I mean, they're probably looking at a third or fourth place finish in the Southeastern Conference, and if you draw them if they're on the bottom half of the bracket and you draw them in the first round, that's not a good matchup.
I agree. Oh yeah.
Yeah, especially for I mean, they would definitely be favored against whoever the third place team in the Foothills Conference would be. If they were to draw that matchup. Although really, I mean, like we were talking in the Northern Eight, like if North Hills winds up beating North Allegheny might be on the bottom half of the bracket too, which that would be kind of crazy too.
Yeah, North Allegheny has a solid team up there. Jeff Clemens, he's a good. I mean, he's a good runner, better than he is a passer, but he's still a decent passer getting it done. And then Clay Byerly, that kid he's really good too. He can play offense and he can play defense.
Yeah, so moving down to AAA now. Thomas Jefferson in the Big Nine Conference has really positioned themselves very well. They're already 4-0 in conference play, and all 4 of their wins were against teams that are in the top half of the conference right now. They beat Ringgold, they beat Bell Vernon, they beat Elizabeth Forward, and they beat Laurel Highlands, which actually, shockingly, Laurel Highlands is the second place team in the Big Nine Conference right now. Sort of based on semantics that they're 3-1 in the conference, and then both Ringgold and Bell Vernon and West Mifflin are all 2-1. But that's kind of how it goes early in the season, where you have some teams that have played non-conference games and some teams that haven't. But I mean, Thomas Jefferson's already pretty much smoked all the top half of the conference, and they should be able to just cruise into the playoffs, feeding off those bottom teams. They still have to play Trinity and Albert Gallatin and Uniontown. And then obviously their rivalry game against West Mifflin to end the season.
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson is that Ringgold game to start off the year just completely shocked me. It was just amazing to see what they do. Austin Kemp has emerged as a star. I mean, he's over 1,000 yards already. He has 20 touchdowns, which is ridiculous. I mean, it's just crazy. And then my rankings, I have them up at 3. I have West Allegheny and Central Valley at 1, 2, and then Ringgold I have 4. Hampton I have a 5, and then 6 Montour. Then Laurel Highlands is going to be new this week and up at 7, and then I had real difficulty with 8. I put Franklin Regional because even though they lost to Knock had a bad loss last week against Gateway.
Aren't you a Gateway alum?
Yes, I am.
Does it feel weird calling that a bad loss?
Yeah, it does. I mean, they have a good defense, I think. If they get together on offense, they maybe could make some noise. They have a good defense, I think. They just have to get the rhythm going on offense.
Yeah, you mentioned Austin Kemp being the leading rusher in the WPIAL, and it's not even close. I just looked it up while you were talking, and he has 1,055 yards so far this year, and the next closest person has 674. So he has 381 more yards than the next highest person, which that's ridiculous through 4 games.
Oh, that is ridiculous. I mean, it's just wow. I mean, I don't even know what to say to that. I mean, it's just amazing how far ahead he is already. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
And I think, even though Ringgold got hammered by Thomas Jefferson in the opener, they came back with a really nice win over West Mifflin last week, so they're positioned pretty well. Laurel Highlands actually has a win over Elizabeth Forward too, which could come into play later in the year, where the top 5 in each conference in AAA are guaranteed a playoff spot, and then the 3 6th place teams have to battle it out for that one wild card spot. So if it comes down to Laurel Highlands and Elizabeth Forward for that 5th spot, then that head-to-head win, I think it was a 1-point game. I think they beat them like 14-13 or something like that. But
Laurel Highlands, I think, did win that game. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I'll tell you what. Even though Trinity's only 1-3 in the conference, they've actually given people some tight games so far this year. So they could play spoiler to someone. It's not quite as tiered in that conference, where even though you've got 6 teams that are playing 500 or better football, and then the bottom three. Uniontown hasn't won, Albert Gallatin hasn't won, and Trinity's just 1-3, and their only win was over Albert Gallatin. But they could play spoiler. They've played some tight games against some teams so far.
Definitely. And then Ringgold, they after getting smacked by Thomas Jefferson, they have really bounced back really well. I mean, beating West Mifflin, and then I'm not sure. They beat Knock. I'm not sure on that.
Not sure either. Yeah, they did. They did beat Knock last week, I think. Or not last week, because Knock lost to Gateway last week. The week before that, I think.
Yeah. And then, yeah. They've bounced back actually really well. So, I mean, I think they're the second best team in that conference. They still have to play Laurel Highlands. I mean, we'll see what happens in that game. Because Laurel Highlands is a team I really don't know too much about. But hey, if they're 3-1, it must be pretty good.
Yeah, they got that 1 point win over Elizabeth Forward to start the season, and then they have wins over Trinity and Uniontown as well. So they've boosted their record with wins over a couple of the bottom teams, but they still have to play Albert Gallatin, and 4 wins might be enough to get them in the playoffs. So hey, good for them. They haven't been to the playoffs in a while. I think at least 4 or 5 years. So that'd be good for them. I think the big game this week in that conference is Bell Vernon and West Mifflin. Both of those teams have got a couple wins against the bottom teams in the conference, so that'll actually tell us a little bit more about how good these teams actually are. Bell Vernon got hammered by TJ, and West Mifflin got beat pretty bad by Ringgold last week. So I think we'll learn a little bit more about those two teams this week.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, West Mifflin, they got another good running back up there. I mean, he might have been shut down last week. D'Angelo Mitchell, man, he probably has like 10 touchdowns at least on the season. So he's definitely good.
Yeah, I think I actually had the Post-Gazette stats page up. I think he was like the 5th or 6th leading rusher in the WPIAL. So I don't have that right in front of me, but I remember seeing his name towards the top of the list. So moving on to the Greater Allegheny Conference, this conference has been crazy this year. It's like, I mean, you don't know from one week to the next who's going to beat somebody. Week 1, Josh Schulteis gets hurt for Mars, and they lose to Indiana. And then Indiana comes back and loses 2 more games to Hampton and Franklin Regional. And then, Mars goes on a bit of a winning streak and beats York and Greensburg-Salem. And then, Knock beat Franklin Regional to start the season and looked like they were going to be one of the teams to beat. And then they got upset by Gateway last week, which was Tom Nola's first win with the Gators. But actually, as things sit right now, Hampton's the top team in the conference. They haven't lost. They're the only one that hasn't lost yet.
Yeah, Hampton they have a pretty good QB from what I've heard, and they are the top team in that conference. At least I think. I mean, you just don't know with this conference. It's just a mystery. I mean, Knock is good, and then they had that loss, and then Franklin Regional, ever since they lost that Knock game, they've come on really strong. So, I mean, this conference is completely up for grabs, and this week Hampton plays Knox, so that's a huge game to decide standings in this conference for sure.
Yeah, and actually Hampton has to play Franklin Regional the week after, so those 2 games are pretty much going to shake out the top of the conference unless like Indiana or Mars goes on some kind of winning streak. But Hampton having Knock and Franklin Regional back to back is going to tell us a lot about who's the best team in that conference.
That Mars, that reminds me, they have an interesting game coming up this weekend. It's a non-conference game. They have Laurel Highlands, so that should be a pretty interesting game to see where both of those teams are. So
Yeah. Actually, I just pulled up Franklin Regional's schedule. They've got, speaking of non-conference games, the next to last week of the season, they have a non-conference game against Thomas Jefferson, which could be two conference champions squaring off in a regular season game. Which, I mean, you want to talk about West Allegheny and Woodland Hills, which would possibly be two potential WPIAL champions squaring off. That's not, TJ and Franklin Regional isn't quite that caliber of a game, but it's still a pretty darn good non-conference game.
that game is going to be really fun. I mean, Austin Kemp and Brett Zanotto, two great running backs, and then Zanotto can play linebacker also, so that'll definitely be an interesting game for the year. Wow, that's a pretty tough schedule.
Yeah, it is. So, I guess I should ask, do you have anything else on the Greater Allegheny Conference? I was going to move on to the Parkway.
Nope.
Okay. In the Parkway Conference, when we talked at the beginning of the year, pretty much everybody said that West Allegheny and Central Valley were the two best teams in AAA, and they're still atop your rankings and probably should be still atop everybody else's. Neither team's really given us any reason to believe they shouldn't be. West Allegheny's sitting atop the standings right now just because they've played 4 conference games, and Central Valley's only played 3, but Central Valley's non-conference game was a win over a very good Quad A Penn Hills team. So that's nothing to shake your hat at either. So I think those two are certainly the best two teams in AAA, and that game between them is going to decide the conference title.
Definitely. I mean, Central Valley and West A, when they play each other, it's going to be a big game. That game's coming up later in the year, and then West Allegheny, like I said, they got that game with Woodland Hills, which is going to mean that game will probably be it's important to know how good you are, so it'll be important to win that game. It's not really that important in terms of maybe standings, because whoever wins that Central Valley West Allegheny game is going to win the conference either way, because tiebreaker goes a conference record. And then the only team I think could actually break the top 2 would be Thomas Jefferson, and that would be it.
Yeah, I agree with you there. West Allegheny's got a game against Montour this week, who is probably the 3rd best team in that conference. But after that, I really can't definitively say. I mean, probably Moon is the 4th best team, but I mean, it's going to be, kind of like we talked about with, which one was that? With the Foothills Conference in Quad A, that finding a 5th place team out of the Parkway to make the playoffs is, most years you could say there was probably 7 teams in the Parkway that deserved to be in the playoffs, whereas this year, it's really up in the air who that 5th place team is going to be. Char Valley's sitting in 5th right now. They've got 2 wins over Hopewell and Blackhawk. Ambridge has a win over Hopewell. Blackhawk has a win over Newcastle, and Newcastle and Hopewell haven't won yet. But really, Hopewell's kind of out of it because they've already lost 4 conference games, but between those other 4 teams, Chartiers Valley, Ambridge, Blackhawk, and Newcastle, it's pretty much wide open because they still all have to play each other for who will get into the playoffs with that last spot in the Parkway.
Montour, I think, is the 3rd best team in that conference, and then after that, I mean, anything could happen. Like you said, maybe Moon or any of those teams, Char Valley, or completely up for grabs, so should be interesting to see how that shakes out.
What game's that? The West Allegheny Central Valley games, the season finale there. So that's going to be for the conference title and possibly probably a preview of the WPIAL championship again, because I can't see either of those teams losing before that game.
Unless unless Austin Kemp and Thomas Jefferson has something to say about that, we'll see. I mean, that's the only team I could probably see knocking off either one of those two.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And someone from the Greater Allegheny Conference could sneak out. I mean, obviously, 4 teams have to make the semifinals, but actually, I think Ringgold might actually be the 4th best team in Quad A right now. Although Franklin Regional is building some steam here too.
Ringgold, I think, is the 4th best team in Quad A with their 2 wins, I think, and then especially that West Mifflin game, they dominated West Mifflin. I didn't see that one coming at all, so that was definitely an impressive win for them.
Yeah. Before we move on to AA here, I'm gonna check Twitter real quick, see if anyone sent me any questions. Nope, haven't gotten anything yet. So, all right, moving on to AA, where there's 3 just huge matchups this week. Basically, 3 conferences that have games that are going to decide the conference champion, which is kind of rare, but it's pretty cool at the same time too. Starting in the Allegheny Conference with Highlands, who we talked about as being a potential sleeper and spoiler in AA at the beginning of the year. They haven't lost yet, and they're playing Apollo Ridge, who had 2 big wins in a row, one over Katanning and then another one over Shadyside Academy last week, with Trey Tipton, who's possibly the best athlete in AA, and then the other running back, Dwayne Brown, who's just had a heck of a year. You went to that game last week, didn't you?
Yes, I did, and I was going to talk about that game actually. And Dwayne, I come up to Apollo Ridge, to Shadyside Academy to see Apollo Ridge, and I come up to see Trey Tipton, and all of a sudden, this kid, Dwayne Brown, this kid's a sophomore. I mean, if you haven't seen him play, he's going to be the next big one at Apollo Ridge for sure. I mean, I got a good nickname for him, Dwayne the Train Brown. And the one touchdown I remembered in that game is they were probably at the 12-yard line, and he was going to get sacked. Somehow he breaks out of both tackles and then scrambles for a touchdown. It was just remarkable. I mean, this kid he's probably one of the more underrated players in the WPIAL, probably because he's a sophomore, and then the fact that you have Trey Tipton and all the attention that he gets. I mean, I remember at the beginning of the season how we said Apollo Ridge might barely make the playoffs, and here they are with a chance to win the championship this Friday. And I'm going to go up to that game when they play Highlands. Highlands is a good team also with Eliza Jackson. I mean, it should be a really fun game. I think I'd be surprised if either one blew out each other, but if Apollo Ridge, if they can handily win that game, they could actually make a lot of noise in the playoffs, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I've been equally surprised at how well Apollo Ridge has played moving up a classification. There's always that kind of question mark of when you move up from single A to double A or double A to triple A. Whether or not how well you'll be able to compete at the next level. But I mean, Apollo Ridge has back-to-back wins against Katanning and Shadyside Academy that were the best 2 teams in that conference last year. So they've certainly proven themselves that they can compete, at the double A level. Actually, it's going to be interesting, kind of coming down the stretch here in the Allegheny Conference, because you've had these games at the top that have kind of sorted things out, but Freeport's kind of stacked some wins in there, and has kind of snuck their way up into the conversation for a playoff spot. And there's 10 teams in the conference, but only 4 can make it. So, Apollo Ridge and Highlands are definitely going to make it, and Shadyside Academy, Katanning, and Freeport are kind of fighting over, two of those three will get the last two spots. But, Freeport's kind of quietly been able to stack some wins here, and their only loss was to Shadyside Academy in the opening game, but they've got wins over Ford City and Deer Lakes and West Shamokin. And if they can keep rolling against those bottom teams and maybe steal a win against Katanning or somebody else, they might be able to sneak their way into the playoffs too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if the top four in that conference, hands down, I think are Highlands, Apollo Ridge, and then Shadyside Academy, and who am I forgetting? Katanning.
Katanning, yeah, either Katanning or Freeport probably for the last spot. Yeah,
Freeport. They could, if they knock off one of those teams, I mean, they could make the playoffs. So, if you play them, you just can't lose that game and don't overlook them. That's the last thing you want to do. I mean, Katanning has a good offense. They need to improve on defense, I think. That's what we talked about at the beginning of the year also.
Yeah. One of my buddies went to the Highlands Katanning game last week, and he said both teams just kept turning the ball over. I mean, when I saw the score, I think it was 24-14 or something like that. I was surprised at how low scoring it was given those two teams, but he was telling me how, both teams would drive the ball down the field and just fumble or throw a pick, like at the 10-yard line or at the 5, and it was just pretty much both teams moved the ball with just back and forth turnovers all night, which will kill you. But, I mean, Katanning's put up 151 points already this year, which is nothing to slouch at either. I think they have the second best offense so far in that conference. It's kind of hard to tell in AA because you've got two conferences with the Allegheny Conference and the Century Conference that have 10 teams in them, so they're not going to play any non-conference games. So you're not really going to get a good sense of how good these teams are compared to other AA teams until they get to the playoffs.
Yeah, I agree. And then the AA is just so tough to make the playoffs, especially in these two conferences where you got 10 teams. So, I mean, only 4 can make the playoffs. It's less than 50%. So, I mean, we talk about how in AAA some teams might make the playoffs, but AA is just so deep. Some good teams are going to miss the playoffs, unfortunately.
Yeah, and speaking of good teams and how tough it is to make the playoffs, I mean, the Century Conference is stacked with good teams. I mean, after Seton LaSalle beat Steel Valley last week, I think you can pretty clearly say that South Fayette and Seton LaSalle are the top 2 teams in the conference. But once Quaker Valley gets their quarterback back from injury, they're going to be a team to be reckoned with, and South Park is a decent team that actually has a head-to-head win over Quaker Valley already. So that's 5 teams already that are fighting for 4 spots. The Century Conference is a really deep conference, and there's some teams at the bottom that could play spoiler too. Like Keystone Oaks has played some tight games against people. Their quarterback, I think he's actually one of the top 2 or 3 passers in the entire WPIAL. Let me pull that up here. They haven't won a game yet this year, but they're capable of scoring some points and playing spoiler to somebody.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, South Fayette and Seton LaSalle are definitely the 2 best teams, I think, in that conference, because South Park actually played their first game was against Seton LaSalle on a Saturday, and Seton LaSalle kind of squeaked out that win. It was 19-8 or something like that. So South Park has a good team, and then Quaker Valley's good, and then the other team you mentioned, what was the other team? I can't remember.
Steel Valley.
Steel Valley.
Dwayne Murray, the running back's putting up a ton of yards this year. Speaking of yards, I pulled it up. Actually, Kobe Filippi, the Keystone Oaks quarterback, has 825 passing yards this year, which is actually more than Brett Brumbaugh has at South Fayette, which is kind of crazy.
That's pretty good. I mean, if you're ahead of Brett Bombraw, you know you're good. So yeah, they could definitely play a spoiler to someone if they're trying to make the playoffs. So yeah, that could actually be a huge factor also.
Yeah, yeah. The Century Conference is actually the only conference that doesn't have a game this week that will likely decide the conference champion. But you've still got Steel Valley and Quaker Valley playing each other, and South Park playing East Allegheny, which all those teams are kind of in that middle pack of 3 through 6 in the conference, and only 2 of them are going to make the playoffs. So this is the point in the season where we start to see teams separate out.
Yeah, it's hard to believe we're actually midway through basically. So we're gonna find out who's for real and who wants to make the playoffs and who doesn't. And I think after St. LaSalle and South Fayette, I mean, it's completely up for grabs. I mean, especially I think Steel Valley, and then Quaker Valley, and then the other team. Oh, jeez.
South Fayette, Seton LaSalle, Steel Valley, Quaker Valley, South Park are the 3.
South
Or
Park,
the 5. Yeah. Just a quick non-WPIAL update. I know you're a Red Sox fan, but the Brewers lost and the Pirates are heading into the 9th inning with a lead. So if the Buccos close this out, they'll be heading to the playoffs for the 2nd straight year.
That's good. I agree with that. I mean, I think the Red Sox are winning. I'm not even watching that game right now.
Yeah, I just saw Twitter blowing up here, and I was kind of like, oh, wonder if they won, so I checked real quick. So moving down to the Interstate Conference, there is a game here this week that should decide the conference title between Mount Pleasant and Washington. That these 2 teams are pretty clearly the best 2 teams in the conference, and actually I think Mount Pleasant has like a 13 or a 14 game conference winning streak because they ran the table in the conference last year, and then they're 4-0 in conference play this year. So even though they lost in the playoffs to Beaver last year, they haven't lost a conference game in quite a while. So this should be a good one between the Vikings and the Little Prexies.
Definitely. I mean, Washington has come off of a couple of scares against Waynesburg Central. I mean, they've actually played some teams close, so they're a team that will probably make the playoffs there. And then Washington and Mount Pleasant is going to be a huge game this week. Both teams are unbeaten, and then anyone can win that game. I mean, I don't have Mount Pleasant actually in my rankings because that's actually how deep the AA is. I mean, I got South Fayette at 1, and then Alquip at 2, and then Seton LaSalle 3, Washington 4, Highlands up at 5, and then 6 I got Apollo Ridge, 7 New Brighton, and then 8 Beaver. I mean, Mount Pleasant, even though they're not ranked, they're still a great team, and if they knock off Washington, they'll definitely be up there the week after that.
Yeah, I mean, there's 8 undefeated teams in AA right now, and you mentioned Waynesburg. They had 2 just heartbreaking losses in back-to-back weeks. I think Washington, they were tied with Washington late, and then gave up a late touchdown and lost to Washington. And I think they were beating Mount Pleasant late in that game too, and Mount Pleasant drove down and scored a game-winning touchdown there. So just back-to-back really tough losses for Waynesburg, but that's a program that's really turned themselves around too, and they're going to be right in the mix to make the playoffs with McGuffey and Southmoreland, who aside from my alma mater, North Catholic, I really don't have a major rooting interest in any teams, but I kind of like to follow storylines, and Southmoreland hasn't made the playoffs since 1979, so I kind of would like to see them make it, but they lost to McGuffey last week, so they're probably going to have to beat Waynesburg if they want to make it. And Waynesburg hasn't made the playoffs in quite a while either. So, seeing either one of those teams in there is going to be a good story for their fans just because of how long they've been at the bottom of their conference for.
Definitely. I mean, after Washington and Mount Pleasant, I think that conference is up for grabs. I mean, I think Waynesburg Central was proven just because of how close they've played the bigger teams in that conference that they are probably the third best team in that conference, but we'll just have to see.
Andrew, I'm throwing a box down there.
Yep. 2 more outs to go for the Buccos to make the playoffs. But yeah, Mount Pleasant, Washington this week definitely was going to decide the conference title there. And actually, I wanted to give a bit of a shout out to some of the teams at the bottom of the conference because a couple teams got off the schneid in the last couple weeks. Derry had one of the longest losing streaks in the WPIAL. Actually, there were 3 teams that carried pretty long losing streaks. Derry, Burgettstown, and Brownsville had 3 of the 5 longest losing streaks entering the season, and both Derry and Burgettstown, actually they both beat Charleroi in the last 2 weeks. Derry won 2 weeks ago, and Burgettstown won last week. So, congrats to those teams for finally getting a win after years of not winning. I think, let me see here, I had it right in front of me. I think Burgettstown had lost like 24 straight games. They hadn't won since 2011. And Derry had lost like 20 straight games. They hadn't won since August of 2012, which was basically the first week of the season. So, congrats to those teams. And maybe the Interstate Conference will get the hat trick this year. And Brownsville will get off the schneid too. I think they've lost 22 straight games now because they're 0-4 this year.
Yeah, I mean, it's good for those teams. You don't want to lose for too long, so you want to be able to get a win eventually, and good for those programs to get a win. I mean, I think the good story, out of that conference, like I said, is Waynesburg Central. I mean, hopefully they make the playoffs. That'll be a good story and see what they do. I mean, they're probably going to draw one of the elites, so, I mean, at least you make the playoffs, so.
Yeah, they've proven that they can hang with some of the better teams though with their close games against Mount Pleasant and Washington in the last couple of weeks. And moving down to the Midwestern Conference, we have our third game that will probably decide a conference title, and our third matchup of undefeated teams between New Brighton and Aliquippa this week, which might be a little bit surprising that we're talking about New Brighton's the one that's challenging Aliquippa for the conference title. But they're both undefeated. Beaver smoked Beaver Falls a few weeks ago. I think that was like 35-0. And then New Brighton turned around and just hammered Beaver last week. It was they came from Beaver was up on them, and New Brighton just stormed back on them in the second half and beat them pretty handily. So as things sit right now, New Brighton and Aliquippa are the top 2 teams in the conference, and this is Aliquippa's first big test of the season. They've got 4 wins against 4 of the teams in the bottom half, but they've got to play New Brighton and Beaver Falls here. But I think that this game against New Brighton, I actually do think New Brighton's the second best team in the conference.
Yeah, we're gonna find out a lot about this Aliquippa team because they got that game this week against New Brighton, which could decide a conference. And then they got to play Beaver, and then they got to play Beaver Falls. So they got all 3 of those games, which is probably the best 3 other teams in the conference. I mean, you mentioned New Brighton. Beaver, the week before that, they smacked Beaver Falls 35-0. And then New Brighton, they were beating them, and then their offense just put on a show. I mean, who knows what can happen in that New Brighton Aliquippa game this week? It's gonna It will ultimately, I think, decide the conference. Although New Brighton, I don't think has played Beaver Falls yet, so maybe Beaver Falls could maybe make some noise if they can beat New Brighton and Aliquippa, despite losing to Beaver.
Looking at and looking at that, it's kind of crazy that they actually have 4 out of their last 5 games are at home. So they actually get New Brighton, Beaver, and Beaver Falls all at the Pit, which that's probably outside the Wolverine one of the toughest places to play a high school football game. So that's a huge boost for Aliquippa. And looking at Beaver Falls' schedule, they play New Brighton the next to last week of the year, and then Aliquippa the last week. So they could get themselves back in position to make a run at it with finishing up against those 2 teams. But I think huge advantage for Aliquippa playing New Brighton, Beaver, and then Beaver Falls all at home. And then they actually have a non-conference game against Mount Pleasant, which should be interesting because those could be the 2 conference champions coming out there, which could have some seeding implications once we get to the playoffs. Actually, while we're talking here, I think probably the most impressive streak going right now is that Aliquippa has won 42 straight conference games. They haven't lost a conference game since 2009, which is absolutely incredible.
The year I graduated, yeah, and that was a long time ago. So, yeah, that is definitely an impressive streak. And then that playing at the Pit against all 3 of those teams, that I agree is a huge advantage. I mean, if you read SI's article about Aliquippa, it's just that stadium has such an advantage for them. I mean, how the community comes together and all that for the football games, and then it's an amazing stadium. I mean, from what I've heard.
Yeah, I've never been there. I'd like to go someday. I hear the gyros are incredible there too. Although that might just be from listening to Craig Wolfley talk all the time about food.
I've heard that also from several other people. So, I mean, yeah, I'd like to go up there, even though it's a really far travel for me. So.
Yeah. So it's a pretty great slate of games on the whole in AA this week. Like we said, you've got Apollo Ridge and Highlands in the Allegheny Conference, where the winner there will probably will be the favorite to win the conference title. You've got Mount Pleasant and Washington, the Interstate Conference, where the winner there will be the favorite for the conference title, and then New Brighton and Aliquippa, where the winner there will definitely have the inside track to the conference title. So this is a heck of a week for AA to kind of separate some teams out. And it's kind of weird that we're only halfway through the season and we're talking about who's going to win conference titles already. But these are some huge games this week. So you have any other thoughts as we wrap up AA here?
I agree. I mean, last week in AA had a good set of games, but this week is better. I mean, 3 games that could decide. I mean, should be really fun. I mean, Highlands and Apollo Ridge, and then Aliquippa, New Brighton, and then Washington and Mount Pleasant. I mean, the remarkable thing, just about all of them are usually up there at the top, basically, every year after year.
Yep. So I just checked Twitter to see if anyone sent us any questions, which we didn't get any questions, but the Pirates are going to the playoffs for 2 consecutive years now, which is a pretty incredible accomplishment. Last time they did that I was about 6 years old, so I didn't really think I'd ever see that happen for a while. Moving on down to Class A, the Big 7 conference has been kind of wild this year. I mean, you've got Neshannock, who's clearly the best team in that conference, and then I could not tell you who not only who the next best team is, because I really don't know at this point, but even who the 4 teams are that are going to make the playoffs, after Neshannock and then 3 others. But Southside Beavers got a couple wins. Riverside has a couple wins. Shenango actually has 2 wins already this year. And then Western Beaver has 2 pretty surprising losses. I mean, at the beginning of the year, I thought they were the second best team in that conference, but they're only 1-2, and they've lost to Riverside and Shenango. And then Rochester's down at the bottom. They're 0-4, and I really don't know what's going on there. That's really surprising to see them all the way down.
Yeah, I'm actually looking up at standings right now. I mean, after Neshannock is clearly the best team, I think, in that conference. And with their running game, and then Eli Owens, and then after that, I mean, you got Riverside
Yeah,
2-1, Southside Beaver 2-1. Then Shenango, you got at 2-1, and then you got Vincentian, you got at 1-1, so they could actually make some noise. And then the key game in that conference this week is Southside Beaver plays Vincentian, so Vincentian actually has a pretty decent team for a first-year program.
Yeah. That's been one of those conferences this year that you don't know who's going to win a game week to week. It's been kind of crazy.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, Southside Beavers, one team I actually have in my rankings. I got North Catholic at 1, and then Clarendon at 2, which should be pretty obvious, and then Jeanette at 3, and then Neshannock I got up at 4, then Avonworth at 5, Best Center at 6, and then Southside Beaver I have at 7, and then 8 Fraser. I mean, once you get to the bottom, I mean, of that 8, it's actually difficult to rank.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think pretty clearly, whatever order you put them in, North Catholic, Clareton, Jeanette, Avonworth, and Neshannock. I don't really think there's any debate that those are the top 5 teams in Single A this year. Speaking of my alma mater, the defending state champion North Catholic Trojans, they've got a non-conference game against Riverside this week, so that should give us a little bit of a sense of how the Big 7 might stack up with against some other conferences. And North Catholic and Avonworth, October 10th. That's North's homecoming game, which that's probably going to decide the conference champion there, because North just smoked Brentwood last week, who I thought was probably the 3rd best team in that conference. Fort Cherry hasn't really shown that much this year. Bishop Canavan's shown a little bit, but I kind of thought Brentwood was probably the 3rd best team behind North and Avonworth. But back-to-back weeks, Brentwood's just gotten hammered by Avonworth and North Catholic, so I think it's pretty much title there.
Yeah, I mean, North Catholic and Avonworth are probably, I think, are clearly the 2 best teams in that division, and then they're going to play for a conference title, like you said. I mean, Avonworth has a good team, so it should be a fun game. Then after that, I agree, Brentwood is probably the 3rd best team. They got a non-conference win that first week against Vincentian, which should win that game. So then after that, let me look.
Yeah, Fort Cherry's been okay. Bishop Canavan's been okay, but Chartiers Houston's been okay. Northgate and Ulsh kind of just bringing up the rear in the conference right now, but I mean, it's pretty much North Catholic, Avonworth, and everybody else right now.
Yeah, and then Fort Cherry, I think they could probably make some noise, but who knows? I mean, after those 2, any 2 teams could probably make it from that conference, unless if you're like winless or something.
Yeah, I think Fort Cherry plays Avonworth this week, so that's that will pretty much cement Avonworth as the team that's going to challenge between Avonworth and North Catholic for the conference title. That once if Avonworth wins that should put them pretty squarely in the top two. And I mean, obviously I'm a North Catholic alum, so I'm a little bit biased towards my alma mater. But Avonworth's got a good team too. They've got a 6'4" quarterback who Zach Chandler. I think he's a junior, and then they've got a wide receiver that's pretty tall too. I think he's like 6'4", 6'5". So they've got some offensive weapons on that team that can play. So it should be a good game. I'm going to try and make it up to Lieutenant J.C. Stonefield for that game, and so just. I'll take a minute and just shamelessly plug my alma mater here that North Catholic has just been, even better than they were last year. Their running game has been incredible so far this year. Jerome Turner has just been a monster coming out of the backfield, and then PJ Fulmore can just play from all over the field. They're lining him up everywhere. He's taking Wildcat snaps. He's, lining up at running back. He's lining up in the slot and catching passes. They're running reverses to him. He's probably the best. Well, I don't want to say he's the best athlete in Class A because, there's some really good kids at Clareton too, but he's certainly up there. I know the guy who runs the WPIAL Insider account had PJ Fulmore as the #1 recruit in this year's recruiting class. So, his athleticism cannot be questioned. He's an incredible player. Now that they have Adam Charlo back at quarterback, that's just another dimension of that offense that they haven't had this year. Everyone's been talking about how many points Clareton has put up this year, and Clareton has put up a ton of points this year. Don't get me wrong, we'll get to that in a minute. But North Catholic has scored 207 points through 4 games, which is over 50 points a game, and that's nothing to shake your head at either. It's been 4 very dominant offensive performances from the Trojans.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, North Catholic's offense it's so good. I mean, you got Jerome Turner and PJ Fulmore at running back. I mean, both of them are good, and then you got Adam Charlo back from injury, which is it just adds a whole another dimension to an offense, which is, I mean, assuming they play Clareton at Heinz Field, you're definitely going to need it. I mean, you wouldn't be able to beat them with just a running game. Adam Charlo adds a whole nother dimension to that offense. And then, like I said, Avonworth, I mean, they got that quarterback, he's 6'4", 225. I mean, that's a good-sized quarterback there, so... And he's got a tall receiver. That should be a really fun game. It's going to definitely decide that conference crown. But I think North Catholic I would give an edge to.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you there, although obviously I'm a little bit biased, and I don't have Josh here to make fun of me this time either. So, but moving on to the Eastern Conference and Clareton, I mean, it's just been incredible what they've done this year. I mean, 300 points through 4 weeks is ridiculous. I think there were only like 30 out of 125 WPIAL teams that scored 300 points last year in 9 regular season games. They've done it through 4. They're just, I mean, it's just absurd. And, it's so impressive what they've been able to do. And I think I saw they only have 22 kids on their team, too. So, there have been people that have made comments about like them running up the score, but they only have 22 kids on their team. They don't have anyone else that they can put in, and it's so impressive what they've been able to do.
I mean, yeah, I just don't. Week after week, they beat Greensburg Central Catholic, who's always a power. They just smacked them like they were like absolutely nothing. It's shocking how good they are. I mean, you talk about in terms of how good that team might be, they're probably up there with that Terrell Pryor, Jordan Hall, Jeanette team that broke that WPIAL record, and then they're on pace to shatter that record through 9 games and through 16 games if they win the championships and all that. And then the cool little fact I want to share is through 9 games, they are on pace to score 675 points. And I did some research. According to NFHS.org, the national record for 10 games or under is tied for 2 teams. Clarendon's on pace for 675, and the record was set by, I think, 2 teams. Jersey Shore, I want to say, and Jefferson scored 676, so they're literally barely off of that record. So that's should put in perspective how good they are.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, and actually, I think I was tweeting it out last week that Jeanette has that Terrell Pryor Jeanette team has the state record. I think they scored 860 points in a season, which was all 16 games through the state championship. And at the pace Clareton's on right now, which is 75 points a game, Clareton would surpass Jeanette's 16-game record in their 12th game, which would be in the WPIAL semifinals, which would be just absolutely absurd that they could pass Jeanette's state record, for how many points they scored in a 16-game season before the WPIAL season even ends, which is just ridiculous.
Yeah, I actually have the numbers. Jeanette, that team put up 513 in the regular season and then 860 through that state championship. So.
Yeah, and speaking of Jeanette, I mean that team's no slouch either. I mean they've scored over 200 points this year. Jeanette's kind of beaten up on some of the bottom teams in the conference. They've got wins over Sarah Catholic and Riverview and Wilkinsburg and Leechburg, who are the bottom 4 in that conference right now. But they're probably the only team that can even have a hope of slowing Clareton down. Monessen played a close game against Greensburg Central Catholic. That was kind of a slugfest, but after seeing the way Clareton hammered Greensburg Central Catholic, I don't think Monessen really stands much of a chance there. I think Jeanette's really the only one that has any hope of slowing them down in conference play at least.
I completely agree. I mean, they're number 3 up in my rankings, and Jeanette, they do have some. That's going to be a really interesting game later in the year when they play at Clarendon. That game's in Clarendon, I believe. I'm not sure on that. It should be a really fun game, but as of right now, I mean, if you're Springdale, you're the only team to score on Clarendon, so I guess it's a little bit of an accomplishment considering how good they're playing.
Yeah, actually, that's next week that Clareton plays Jeanette. So Clareton has Riverview this week, and then they play Jeanette next week. So whenever they realigned the conferences and put Clareton and Jeanette together, that was kind of the game that everyone circled on their calendar, anyways, that they wanted to see. So I'm kind of hoping that Root Sports will broadcast that game next week, because that's going to be an absolutely star-studded game.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, all I gotta say is if Clarendon can somehow blow out them, they just might be too good for everyone. I mean, North Catholic's good, but if they play Clarendon and North Catholic at Heinz Field, I think it's going to be a spectacular game. I mean, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, it will be. And actually, I mean, you mentioned about Springdale being the first team to score on Clarendon. I think what's equally as impressive is, besides them putting up 300 points, is just how well their defense has played this year. They didn't give up points until the fourth game of the season. They were I think they were the only team that entered the fourth week of the season without having given up points in the first three games. And North Catholic's defense is no slouch either. Actually, I think they've given up a couple touchdowns on kick returns. I know they gave up one to Northgate in the opener, but that was what was so impressive last year in the Class A championship game, because everyone wanted to talk about Stowe Rox's offense and Lenny Williams and how good they were. And North Catholic's defense, especially their defensive line, just controlled that game and really just didn't give Lenny Williams any time to throw and shut down Stowe Rox's running game. So, offense is really easy to talk about, especially for high school football, because it's we see the passing stats, we see the rushing stats, we see how many touchdowns people have scored, but defense doesn't really get as much press for high school football. But both of these teams, North Catholic and Clairton, play outstanding defense.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Clairton, how they've basically shut out through 4 games of the season. Their defense is good, and then North Catholic has a good defense too. I mean, that game, I think if they play each other, I think it would be more of an offensive game, but you never know. I mean, both teams can play both sides of the ball well.
Yeah, it was like the one year, I think Clairton played Rochester in the championship game, and both offenses had put up a ton of points the whole year, and the championship game wound up being like 12-8 or something like that, or 13-12. Or I remember it was a really low scoring championship game. I think that was when Derek Moy played at Rochester.
Yeah, you just never know. I mean, I didn't think New Brighton and Beaver would actually be. Well, what game I want to mention? I can't remember. I wanted to mention a AA game, but I forget. Then, I mean, it should be. Clarendon, Jeanette has a good defense too, so that game could actually be a defensive game also. But I think that would be more of an offensive game. But we'll see.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see, how things kind of shake out in the Eastern Conference as far as the playoffs go, because, you've got Monessen, who lost to Greensburg Central Catholic, and then Springdale's kind of hanging around there, but they actually lost a game to Leechburg, where I think like half their team got hurt in that game. I have a cousin that plays for Springdale, and I kind of heard through the family grapevine that they had a lot of kids get injured in that game and wound up losing to Leechburg. But really, Springdale still plays Monessen and plays Greensburg Central Catholic. So if they can beat one or both of those teams, they're going to be right back in the playoff hunt too. So I think it's pretty much between those three, between Monessen, Greensburg Central, and Springdale for the last 2 playoff spots there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, after Clarendon and Jeanette, yeah, I mean, it's completely up for grabs. I mean, Monessen, and then Greensburg Central Catholic, and then Springdale is a team that's capable of making the playoffs. So this should be a fun, after those, the top 2, which should be an interesting race.
Yep. So let's see. Let's check Twitter here one more time. No questions from anyone. So we'll move on down to the Tri-County South, which actually had a huge win this year. Beth Center knocked off Greensburg Central Catholic in a non-conference game. So that actually may have some pretty big implications come playoff time, where maybe the Tri-County South won't get the short end of the stick from the WPIAL seating committee this year, since they kind of proved themselves a little bit in non-conference play. But down there, Fraser and Beth Center are really just running away with it right now. They're the only 2 undefeated teams in the conference, and everyone else has at least 2 losses. So that's I think they play in a couple weeks, and that's certainly a game to circle on the calendar, because that one is going to decide the conference title.
Yeah, I agree. for that conference. It's going to be Fraser and Best Center, and that was a huge win for Best Center. I mean, Greensburg. The key is, though, Greensburg Central Catholic. I mean, if you're Best Center, you want to root for them all day because the more they win, if they get impressive wins, that makes the Tri-County South. I mean, it could have a huge impact on seeding whoever wins that Best Center Fraser game. And Best Center actually has a pretty good running back down there, and Anthony Welsh. I mean, he's probably up there on the board for rushing yards and touchdowns for leaders for sure.
Yeah, I actually closed out that tab that I had the rushing leaders on. Let me see if I can pull that back up. But actually, the interesting thing in the Tri-County South, obviously those are the top two teams, but figuring out who the other two teams are that are going to make the playoffs is just totally up in the air right now because you've got four teams that are sitting at 2-2 in the conference right now. Bentworth, who knocked off Avella last week, which was somewhat of an upset, but really put Bentworth back in the playoff conversation and really hurt Avella's chances. And then Mapletown is 2-2. Jefferson Morgan is 2-2. And then you've got Carmichael's kind of hovering there at 1-2. So I mean that's five teams right there that are fighting for the last two playoff spots behind Fraser and Beth Center. And if you asked me to pick two today that are going to make it, I really couldn't tell you just because they've all kind of beaten each other. Avella's beaten Jefferson Morgan. Mapletown beat Carmichael's, Bentworth beat Avella, so it's they've all beaten each other a little bit, and they all still have to play a lot of games against each other. So it's up in the air, but just as far as dramatic playoff races, it's certainly one worth keeping an eye on.
I mean, it's going to be interesting after those two to see how that conference plays out. I mean, just a bunch of teams at 2-2 there, and then you got that 1-2 team, and then the game of the year so far this year, I think it went triple or 4 overtimes was between Sarah Catholic and West Green, yeah. I want to say. And West Green won like 44-41 or something like that. I can't remember. So,
yeah.
That's a close game.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And actually, you had to kind of feel bad for Sarah Catholic. They had a 23-game losing streak heading into that game last week, and went to 4 overtimes against West Green. And West Green wound up pulling it out for the victory in 4 overtimes. But I mean, man, Sarah Catholic certainly put everything they had into that game. That had to be heartbreaking. I think their last win was like 2011. Yeah, they haven't won in like 3 years, and that was so close last week.
I mean, you mentioned Sarah Catholic, and you remember how that one year they had that great team that got to Heinz Field, and then it's just amazing how far they've actually dropping off. It's just amazing. And I'm reading this on Twitter. They lost 44-43 in 4 overtimes to West Green. And then I'm reading this stat right here. Is West Green, through its first 3 games, scored 6 points, and they dropped 44 against Sarah Catholic, which is just, that's an amazing stat right there. I mean, it's just, wow.
Yeah, like you were mentioning, Sarah Catholic, they won the WPIAL championship in 2007. They actually made the playoffs 4 straight years from 2006 to 2009 and won the championship in 2007. And then since then, like 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, they've just, I don't know what happened, if like they just graduated a whole bunch of good players or something, but they just kind of dropped off the map and just fell all the way down to the bottom of the conference. But yeah, that I remember that I remember when I was updating my standings page that I saw that West Green had only scored 6 points all year and then scored 44. I mean, granted, depending on how much they scored in overtimes, you're talking 4 overtimes. That's possibly anywhere between 26 to 32 points. assuming they scored touchdowns every time, in overtime. But still, that's a heck of a point spread there. And really, that's kind of been the bane of Sarah Catholic's existence, that their defense just hasn't been able to stop anyone. I think they've had the worst defense in the WPIAL as far as points allowed, like 3 out of the last 4 years or something like that. They've given up a ton of points.
I mean, I dread this thought. I mean, if they can give up to a team that scores 6 points coming into that game and they drop 44 on them, they still have to play that Clarendon team, which hopefully Clarendon doesn't go too high, but we'll see.
Yeah, let's see here. Yeah, last year, yes, Sarah Catholic only played 8 games last year because they were in that conference where Imani Christian was supposed to be, and then they dropped out, so some people didn't play a 9th game. But in 8 games, Sarah gave up 446 points last year, which is, let's see, some quick mental math here. Yeah, that's 55 points a game last year. So that's, yeah, I mean, Sarah just hasn't been able to stop anybody. Their offense is actually decent. Their offense can move the ball and can score points, but their defense, they just cannot stop anyone. And you got to feel bad for those kids and for the fans and all that. But it's just they just have not been able to stop anybody.
Hopefully they can get a win eventually.
So,
I mean,
yeah, that game, that non-conference game against West Green. Yeah, that non-conference game against West Green was probably their best chance for a win this year. Looking at their schedule, just because, I mean, you never know. They could always surprise somebody, but they've got to play Greensburg Central Catholic this week. And then, well, actually, they've got Riverview the week after that, who's been kind of a down team the last few years, and then they have Clarendon on October 10th, and then they finish up against Leechburg and Wilkinsburg, who are 2 of the bottom half teams in the Eastern Conference. So they've got a couple opportunities, but the West Green one was certainly their best shot so far. So, I think they've probably got one of the longest losing streaks in the WPIAL now. I think Shaler's got the longest, and Shaler's got the longest, and then Sarah's got the second longest. So you never know. Maybe they'll be able to get off the schneid. Hopefully for them and their fans, they can, since they haven't won one since 2011, which is just a crazy long time.
Yeah, it is, and it's unfortunate.
Yep. So, all right. Well, that's pretty much all I got right now. So I'll give Twitter one last check here. Looks like everyone's celebrating the Pirates. No one asked us any questions that I saw. So, you have any other final thoughts as we close this one up?
Not that I can think of. No. I mean, how about we give who we think are the top 2 teams, who we think are going to meet at Hines for each classification real fast.
All right. You want to go first, or you want me to go first?
I'll go first. I mean, in Quad A, I think I'm going to predict Central Catholic and Woodland Hills for the championship, but Pine Richland and Penn Trafford could definitely make some noise. In AAA, I'm going to go a little bit of a surprise, maybe. I'm going to go West Allegheny and Thomas Jefferson. I mean, you just never know with Thomas Jefferson. I mean, imagine if Austin Kemp and Jordan Whitehead, who were probably 2 of the best athletes, or 2 of the better athletes in the WPIAL, going up against each other, maybe. In AA, I think I think South Fayette and Aliquippa, I think, are 1-2, with a bunch of other sleepers, possibly. I mean, and then in single A, I think, is going to be North Catholic and Clarendon.
Well, I certainly can't disagree with your single A pick. Yeah, my preseason pick in Quad A was Woodland Hills and Seneca Valley, and that's certainly not going to happen on Seneca Valley's end. But I'm gonna stick with Woodland Hills, and I'm gonna say Woodland Hills and Pine Richland, just to say something different. Although Penn Trafford's also a very good team. Although granted, the way things kind of usually shake out is that the top three, or the three conference champions, usually get the top three seeds. So it would probably be like if Woodland Hills, Central, and Penn Trafford win the three conferences, then Pine Richland would probably be the fourth seed, which would mean they'd play Woodland Hills in the semifinals instead of in the championship. But why not? I'll say maybe Pine Richland will pull the upset on Central Catholic in the regular season, and then maybe Woodland Hills will burn themselves out beating Central in the semifinals, and then have a good game against Pine Richland in the championship. Maybe the Rams can get back there. First time since they moved up to Quad A, and first time since Neil Walker played there. But I'll go with something different. I'll say Woodland Hills and Pine Richland. I like what's going on at Pine Richland right now. Triple A, my preseason pick was West Allegheny and Central Valley. I think I was the only one on our preseason show that picked Central Valley to win the title, so I'm going to stick with that, actually. I'm going to stick with Central Valley and West Allegheny. Down in Double A, like you said, there's a ton of potential sleepers here. I really liked Highlands coming into the year, and Seton LaSalle is certainly a good team, but South Fayette and Aliquippa were my preseason picks, and they're clearly the best two teams in Double A, so I'm going to stick with with South Fayette and Aliquippa in the championship game. And I think Highlands and Seton LaSalle are semifinal capable there. Apollo Ridge could sneak their way in. Mount Pleasant or Washington could sneak their way in, but I don't think any of those teams are as good as the top four there. So I still like Aliquippa and South Fayette in the championship game. And obviously, I'm going to pick my alma mater, North Catholic Trojans, to make it back to Heinz Field, and I can't pick against Clairton. I got to go North Catholic and Clairton down in Class A.
That sounds good to me.
So I think that's all we got. You want to give one last run through for your Twitter handle and your blog and all that?
Yes, I am Andrew, and I run AJWPIAL on Twitter, and I have my own blog, which is WPIALfootballzone.wordpress.com, and I am a reporter for westernpafootball.net.
Cool. And I'm Ian. I run the Steelers and I'm at the Steelers and NAT on Twitter. It's thesteelersandnat.blogspot.com. I have what I like to think is the best WPIAL standings page on the internet, because it's the only one that has all the tiebreakers with Gardner points, WPIAL points, tiebreakers, conference record, conference wins, all that. It's right off the drop down at the top of the screen. So on Friday nights, I'm usually at home with a sleeping child in my arms, so I don't get out to watch many games, but I kind of follow them all on Twitter. So I usually tweet out scores and random stats and facts about some games, points for playoff positioning, things like that. On Twitter on a Friday night, check out hashtag WPIAL, hashtag MSA scores for people tweeting at the MSA account. And they actually have the best scoreboard that I've seen that gets the most scores updated the quickest. Josh, who was with us in week 1, works for MSA Sports. He's one of their broadcasters. And hashtag Skylights gets some too. So those are the hashtags you want to follow along with. MSA Sports broadcasts a lot of games via internet radio, so that's always a great. And thanks a lot, you guys, for tuning in. Follow us on Twitter at AJWPIAL and at the Steelers and that. And thanks a lot, guys. Take care, and best of luck to everyone the rest of the high school season. Hopefully we'll get a couple more of these shows in. Maybe we'll have a name eventually, too.